The debt came due on a windy dock at Venice, thick with tar and shouting, and it was already larger than the vow. Crusaders had promised to pay for transport east. The city had built the ships and cleared its calendar. When too few pilgrims arrived, the arithmetic snapped tight. This is the story of how contracts and deadlines bent strategy until a sacred journey steered toward Constantinople. The core idea is simple. Money and time, set down in a transport deal, shaped the Fourth Crusade more than intentions did. Because the army could not meet its bill on schedule, it accepted detours that matched its creditors' interests. First, the setup in plain words. In 1201, the leaders agreed that Venice would provide a fleet, crews, and a season's provisions for a great host in exchange for a fixed sum due upon embarkation. The unit of account was the mark, a measure of silver often used in tallies, and the price hovered around 85,000 marks, a figure big enough to idle Venice's normal trade while its shipwrights worked. Venice kept its side. By early summer 1202, the arsenal had churned out war galleys and transports, something near 200 hulls, and kept crews on retainer while grain was stockpiled. A hard date loomed because ships need wind, the Adriatic has seasons, and a city cannot keep docks frozen for long without losing money. Then the pilgrims trickled, not surged. Recruiters had promised more bodies than appeared. Some parties sailed independently from other ports, others never left home, which meant chests arrived too light to satisfy the contract, even as the Doge, old and sharp, stood on the quay with a fleet that had to be paid. Therefore, the bargain changed. If the Crusaders could not pay in marks, they would pay in service by helping Venice capture a rebellious port that had slipped its control. The target was Zara on the Dalmatian coast, a Christian city under a rival king's protection. The papal letters warned against it, but the ledgers on the quay were less forgiving than parchment in Rome. Next came the first detour. Zara fell under bombardment and assault late in 1202, and the army wintered amid uneasy consciences and unpaid balances, with excommunication declared and then partly managed. Debt had not disappeared. It had grown into the room, making every conversation about the next step feel like a negotiation. Into that winter walked an offer that joined money to strategy. A young Byzantine prince, exiled and hunting allies, promised an enormous subsidy, supplies and soldiers if the Crusaders would sail to Constantinople and restore him to his throne. He pledged church union and a war against their common enemies, but the words that mattered most were the numbers. More than enough marks to pay Venice and carry the army onward. This is where deadlines tightened the knot. The sailing season would open soon. Crews expected wages. Provisions grew stale if left too long. Delays bleed fleets as surely as combat does. Because the prince claimed he could pay quickly from imperial treasuries, and because Venice saw profit in removing a rival and opening wider trade, the coalition embraced the plan. Strategy bent around a calendar. Instead of steering to Egypt or Syria, as some had hoped, the fleet headed for the Bosporus in 1203 to make good on a contract of a new kind, cash for thrones. The army did not throw away its vow. It converted it into steps. Restore the prince, draw pay, then continue to the Holy Land. At Constantinople, the first phase seemed to work. The exiled heir was crowned alongside his restored father, and payments began, but revenue and goodwill fell short of promise. Urban politics are harder than oaths, and a coronation does not turn a ledger black overnight. Because numbers rule even palaces, tension rose. Supporters and enemies jostled, fires and shortages soured the city. The new emperor's pledges outran his receipts. When a violent turn in early 1204 swept him aside and a harder ruler took his place, the coalition found itself outside the walls again with a bill and a grievance. Next came the second detour, sharper than the first. If the subsidy would not arrive and the throne would not honor the deal, the crusade sought payment in kind and control by force. Assaults were planned with the same focus that had organized contracts, and the walls fell in April 1204 after a storm of ships, bridges, and street fighting. The result was not a sermon, but an inventory. The victors divided the city's offices and revenues by treaty, shares for Venice, shares for Crusader lords, and a Latin emperor chosen to stand at the center of a new arrangement. Some portion of the treasure went to paying back advances, another portion funded garrisons and ships. The rest tried to patch the hole between vows and reality. A date anchor fixes the hinge. April 1204 marked the capture of Constantinople, the turning point where a campaign financed for the Holy Land established a new state instead. And a single rounded number shows scale. About 85,000 marks had launched the bargain, but the sums that followed, promises twice that size, kept tightening the path toward the Bosporus. Numbers did not end debate, yet they narrowed the menu. Throughout, the papacy's stance remained a boundary condition. Letters condemned attacks on Christians and threatened or imposed spiritual penalties, but the voyage moved on the wind of contracts and the pressure of wages. If the creditors had been satisfied earlier, choices might have widened. If more pilgrims had arrived, the fleet could have sailed for Egypt with its bill paid. Daily life inside the army followed the same logic. Captains worried about fodder and hardtack, about arrears for crossbowmen, about repairing hulls and paying pilots for channels only locals knew. Every delay turned coin into complaint. Every week of pay turned discipline into an expense line that had to be met before ambition could resume. Venice's calculus was practical. The city had suspended broad swaths of commerce to outfit the fleet, gambling one season's profit on a single customer. By steering the coalition to targets that promised port privileges, trading quarters, and the removal of a competitor, it converted risk into advantage. The Crusaders' calculus was layered. Some leaders truly believed the restoration at Constantinople would accelerate a march to Jerusalem. Others saw that payment in Byzantine coin might redeem their debt and restock their army. A few feared the enterprise had already drifted, yet drift feels different when the accounts come into balance and the fleet is intact for the next leg. Uncertainties should be labeled and left. Chronicles disagree on who pushed hardest at each turn, on who hesitated, on the sincerity behind each promise, and on the depth of papal sanctions in practice. What is clear is the scaffolding. Contracts with fixed sums, dates that caught like thorns, and decisions shaped by who could pay whom when. Consider one dockside scene to ground the pattern. A clerk counts sacks of coin, a purser checks barrels of biscuit and water, a crew foreman asks when wages will be paid for rowing against the current. The answer to those three questions determines where sails point more reliably than slogans do. Finally, what remains after the smoke and dividing of quarters is a principle that travels beyond its century. Financing sets routes, even for armies with vows, because debt, deadlines, and the need to keep crews fed compress choices into corridors. The Fourth Crusade moved through those corridors until Constantinople's walls stood where Egypt's coast might have been. The takeaway is clear and unadorned. Follow the money and the calendar, and you can predict the road on this voyage. Cash and dates steered the crusade more than maps of faith did. If this open case file helped you see how contracts can redirect causes, like and subscribe for the next episode.